Danooo is here, and he just came up with this, and this is an impromptu out in a booth, and we're going to do something about the 60s. Danooo was a little younger than me, just a touch. You remember the 60s, Danooo?
Oh, the 60s. Yes, that was when we didn't have any worries, no bills to pay. You wanted a car that you can get them for $50 used in St. Stash. I mean, those were the days when,
those were the days, my friend, we thought they'd never end. Now ask me if I remember the 60s.
You remember it.
What?
Marco, do you remember?
I can't even remember, what year are we in?
We're in 2023 right now.
Who knew? You know, since COVID, I don't even know if I'm coming or going. Mind you, I didn't know if I was coming or going before the COVID, but that's another story. The older you get, the more nostalgic you get. Like, I'm nostalgic about the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
I didn't, but it was hell.
Yeah, I know. I was only a tiny little kid at the time.
You were a little nothing. You were a little...
I was a fisher, and...
Grasshopper.
All I knew... Yeah, that's it, you know. Yes. I mean, it was a different time.
You don't even remember the 60s. Do you remember the Beatles?
I remember singing the Beatles, I Want to Hold Your Hand. I was singing it at night when I was 4 years old.
4 years old? You were singing I Want to Hold Your Hand? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I was singing something else I wanted to hold. I was a little older than you, by myself at night. But that's another story entirely. Yeah, but okay, so you remember the 60s, the Beatles and all that stuff.
Well, right? I was a little picture, but I always heard the Beatles playing.
Yeah.
You know,
but
Can't Buy Me Love. Oh. I mean, I was only a kid. I was dancing to it, but I didn't really
hold it. Your
appreciate
time was the 70s and 80s, no?
That's right.
Yes, you tell you. The punk rockers and the...
No, 70s was all about disco.
Disco. I did the little disco too. I did it because, you know, the 60s were ending and there was a lull, and then there was nothing else, then there was disco. But my time was the 60s. Not 60, not 1960. I'd say around 1964 when the Beatles broke.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you're older than me, so I wasn't I didn't know much about that.
Yeah, I'm finding more about the Beatles now, by the way, on YouTube, doing all these documentaries, and all these guys that give like music teachers and everything, you know. They have these little podcasts or whatever. Finding more about the Beatles than I ever knew back in the old days. You know.
Yeah.
I'm sort of regressing to the 60s, because that was the time when I was fully alive.
I remember when Lennon came to the Queen Elizabeth.
Yes.
And they rented a room, him and Yoko.
Give peace a
chance. And all the reporters came around their bed. They were in bed.
What?
The whole time. And all the reporters came around.
I mean, they were watching them having sex?
Yes.
Sex.
And all the reporters, this is history.
Well, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Can I get
so
video
all the
of them
reporters,
having sex?
You can Google it.
Sex?
Yeah, they had all the reporters around asking questions, like, you know, just... It was a different time.
It was a different time. Give peace a chance. By the way, he was on a world tour. He did it in several locations, not just Montreal, this bedding.
Okay.
But anyways, it's like, and I remember things like on television, you know, the 60s television, like the time tunnel. You are now going into the time tunnel. And they went, I think, into the 50s or the 40s into the time. That was my mother's era. You know, but our era was like starting with the Beatles.
My era was Outer Limits.
You are now in the outer
Don't
limits.
Adjust your telephone settings.
Freak out. And the Twilight Zone.
Twilight Zone. Rod Sterling.
Yeah, and Star Trek.
Star Trek started in '65.
That's right. Star Trek. Leonard Nimoy with the. You can do it. I can never do that.
Here.
What is
I
that?
can do it. I can do this. Here's Spock.
Yeah.
Spock's greeting.
Yeah, I can never do that.
Live long
and prosper.
And Fisher. Okay.
And that was from a Jewish thing. The high priests would give that separate. I don't know why. Separate that hand on the high holidays, on Yom Kippur, I believe, to give the priestly blessing. So Leonard Nimoy actually got that from
Wait a minute,
from going to synagogue.
Leonard Nimoy was Spock in Star Trek. Leonard Nimoy was Jewish because
He is Jewish.
he is Jewish.
Well, he's
I
not
told you,
Jewish.
'cause-
He's not Jewish anymore.
And everyone
He
thought
passed
that
away.
black straight cut hair, that was a yarmulke.
Yeah. Well, actually, William Shatner, who was from Montreal, and went to my high school way before I went to my high school because it was in a different place, Westhill High School. He's Jewish too, by the way.
Yeah.
And Jenny Roddenberry, who was a
Is
Jewish,
Jewish. Yeah.
Jewish policeman, a Jewish policeman. He wrote Star Trek, and you know how Star Trek was saved? You know how it was saved? Because it was
I know.
not going to be renewed. Who
Right.
saved it?
I don't know, but I knew
Lucille-
that William Shatner
Will-
slept in his car for a year.
Well,
no good job.
Lucille Ball saved him.
Really?
Desilu Productions
That was
pushed for
Lucille?
Star Trek to be continued past the pilot. Okay,
Oh, she's wonderful,
Lucille Ball.
She's
You know,
a wonderful human being.
yeah, she was a one. Well, she
Oh,
is.
was.
I met her. I actually met her daughter, Lucy Arnaz, in '79 when I was in New York.
New York City.
I went and I was in a little restaurant at night, and I see Lucy Arnaz there sitting there, and I go up to her and I say, Lucy, I loved you, and they're playing our song or something like that. I think that was the film.
Yeah.
And this is a year later, and I said,
so you saw her.
I saw her there, and she looks at me like, "Thank you." Like who the hell are you? Nobody approaches these people. I approach people.
Yes, you do.
I do that. And, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not good. But
a
the
risk like
60s,
anything
the
else.
60s, man, Woodstock, which I never went to, but I went there 30 years later, 1999, to not the big Woodstock, but 2 months later they had the original Woodstock. It was called A Day in the Garden, and they had they had Mountain there, they had Edgar Winter,
Wow.
they had Arlo Guthrie, they had all these things there, and not too many people knew about it because there was only 10,000 people there. So it was wonderful. But the 60s, man, that's when Forever Young.
Yeah, that's it. It was forever young,
Well,
and
forever
life
young.
was more simple
Yeah.
back then.
Yeah.
Now everything has to be politically
By the way,
correct.
what is that on
I
your
don't
shirt
know.
there?
I have no idea.
I've got the world on a screen with subtitles. Where'd you get that? What is that?
I don't know. I bought it somewhere.
What does it mean?
I don't know.
In other words, you've got the world by the tail.
Yeah.
You've got the world by the
The
tuchus.
tuchus.
All right.
Tuchus again.
With the tuchus. So this is it. This is he's actually, I consider Danny, who is a bro. He's a bro, but I consider him to be like a younger type of 60s, early 70s type of guy, that's who, that's who this guy is to me. But we both went to the Catskills.
Yeah.
Right, at different points in time. You went before, I went later.
Yeah.
The dying of the Catskills and the closing. Before the
closing,
closing, we
the
saw
closing.
acts there. We saw 60s acts
Yeah.
and 70s acts there. Comedians, performers. So the 60s can be with you if you, in your heart, keep forever
Young.
young. Keep on trucking.